Hi everyone, my name is Rob Jackson, and Kim has invited me to speak a little bit about the relationships between social change, social justice, and education. I've been an instructor with the Learning Center on and off for the past 7 or 8 years, and part of that, for all of that time, I've also been a student myself. Graduate student first in the master's program and now in the PhD program at the University of Alberta, where I work with my supervisor Christine Stewart and members of the Writing Revolution in Place collective to ask how creative research, that is research that expresses itself in poetry and art, can help us better understand our relationships and our connective tissues in the world. I mention the Writing Revolution in Place collective because it's a really strong example, I think, of the opportunities for collaboration that the Learning Center has made possible. So the Writing Revolution in Place collective started almost 10 years ago in the basement of Boyle Street Co-op Services, that at that time was the house of the Learning Center. And so the collective is made up of folks who access the Learning Center's services, of Denis, of myself and Christine, and some other graduate students. You can hear my dog barking in the background there. Some other graduate students who were unsatisfied with the learning opportunities that were available to us through the more formal channels of education, and wanted to come together once a week to ask challenging questions in accessible ways. And so by that I mean, though there's lots of academic and theoretical knowledge that underpins our conversations in that collective, just like there's lots of academic and theoretical knowledge that underpins all of the conversations going on in the Learning Center needs assessment process. Asking them in accessible ways means finding a variety of vocabularies and a variety of language to articulate and to talk about these issues. That's what I'm hoping to do today in this little short video outlining the relationship between social change, social justice, and adult literacy or adult education. So first and foremost, what I want to say is that we know that education is both a deeply personal and a deeply collective project. So you have your own reasons for pursuing education. Everyone has their own reasons, whether that's to build your language skills, build your writing skills, build your mathematical or computer skills, or whether it is to pursue a degree towards some sort of job or some sort of employment. And all of those reasons exist, and there's so many more that I can't name right now that exist for pursuing education. And that's why it's an individual thing. We all have our own reasons for educating ourselves. But the reason that's a collective thing is, one, because the institutions and opportunities we have to access education in formal ways, like through the Learning Center and its programs, like through the various programs associated with the ECALA project, as well as through public education, universities, and post-secondary education. All of these things are organized to provide opportunities for collective learning. That is, you learn in a classroom, you learn from someone usually, and you learn collaboratively. Now, we know from literacy rates in Canada, and we know from high school completion rates, and we know from our own experiences that the formal and institutional opportunities to pursue education do not meet all of our needs. And overcoming those barriers, not only of access, but of opportunities offered, is part of what the Needs Assessment Program and the Needs Assessment Research Project, in my understanding that we're all taking part in at the Learning Center, is about. And so that's how education to me is both an individual and a collective project. It's also, I think, related importantly from my own experiences and my own perspective and analysis, is that education throughout history and today in our contemporary moment is also about making the world and making our lives in it more meaningful and more fulfilling, not only for ourselves, but for the people we love and the people we want to be in communities of solidarity or support with. So one strong example of this, I think, is the Black Panther Party, which originated in Oakland in the 1960s, a black party that was a grassroots community-led initiative to support the black community that felt as if and was being neglected by institutions of white supremacy like the police, the school system, employment opportunities, and housing opportunities. The Black Panther Party had a 10-point program, and the first point in that program was that it advocated for the right of every person to fulfill their own destiny. And the way I think about that is to fulfill their own lives and pursue a meaningful, robust, fulfilling, and dynamic relationship to their own life and to the world, where people could bring their own gifts to bear on their world and offer them to their communities in a way that would lead to mutual transformation. So that is their own personal growth, as well as changing the circumstances of their communities in the face of systematic oppression. Part of the Black Panther Party's 10-point program to fulfill the destiny of every person to be their sort of most fulfilled version of themselves, for lack of a better word, part of that was employment. They advocated for the end of capitalism, which they saw as an exploitative and damaging process. They also advocated for the end of police brutality. They advocated for the end of prisons and incarceration. They advocated for housing for all, but they also advocated for meaningful educational opportunities that not only gave people the basic skills of literacy and mathematics to get by in the world, to get jobs, but also education that exposed what they called the true nature of American society. So in my understanding, they wanted a critical education that reflected the real structures of power that were operating. For the Black Panther Party, the pursuit of education, from children's education to adult education, was inseparable from the goal of transforming the conditions of people's lives to make them more fulfilling, more exciting, and more equitable. Another example of the importance of adult literacy and education to social transformation and social change was during the Cuban Revolution, when, maybe you're familiar with the person named Che Guevara. Many people wear his face on t-shirts and stuff like that. What the Cuban Revolution sought to do was secure independence for Cuba as a nation, and challenge the ways that the imperialism of the United States limited the opportunities for employment, education, and flourishing of the Cuban people. What was super important during this process was that a revolutionary struggle to transform the conditions of people's lives was inseparable from an emphasis on literacy, so that people could have the skills to critically analyze their own lives. There's my dog again. Their own lives and their own situations, so that everyone could be a self-determining individual. That means that everyone could make decisions based on a critical understanding of their own situations and their own lives, and feel empowered to transform themselves and transform their communities and their societies to be a more just and equitable place. Now, the reason I say all of this is because right now, when we think of education, I think especially when we think of adult education, we think of it in terms of pursuing a goal. And usually that goal is an individual one, right? And those individual goals are extremely important, and this is not to take away from any of those. But what the community-led needs assessment at the Learning Center, I think, is challenging us to think about is how is the pursuit of our own goal for education tied to the pursuit of more just and equitable systems where the gap between the rich and the poor, the gap between Black, Indigenous, and people of color and white people is not so large, where the gap between Canadian citizens and immigrants, refugees, and migrant laborers is not such a big divide. And the way that we can address needs, what are the needs of our communities, are not only the needs of our individual selves, but also the needs of the communities we find ourselves in. This relationship between the personal or the individual and the collective or the systems that organize our social life, I think is at the heart of the relationship between education and social change. So, when we're pursuing our needs assessment, I want to challenge you to think about what are the needs that must be addressed by our educational institutions and by our educational opportunities. Do we need to produce learner-written, student-written curriculum? By that I mean, do students, former students and current students, need to direct the curriculum of the Learning Center? Do they need to direct what they learn about, how they learn about it, and why they learn about it? Do we need to produce pamphlets about the situations we find ourselves in, pamphlets about our working conditions, pamphlets about public transit, pamphlets about adult education, pamphlets about voting rights and democracy? Do we need to write more poetry, create more art installations? All of these are opportunities that we can take up, you know what I mean? And finally, we have to think about not only coming up with needs assessment, identifying needs, but we think about how we're going to achieve those needs. The time has passed, there's been so much research done on what barriers to education are, and so I challenge you all to think about today and in the future of this project, something I always think about, which is how can we educate ourselves not only about what needs to be done, but educate ourselves in a way that can help us organize and mobilize towards what must be done. In other words, rather than a separation between the classroom and the world, how can we make the world a part of the classroom and education a tool for organizing and mobilizing ourselves and our communities to make the sorts of changes that we so often direly need? The prison abolitionist and Black feminist organizer Miriam Kaba puts this in a really beautiful way, I think. She says, "Organizing is both a science and an art. It is thinking through a vision, a strategy, and then figuring out who your targets are, always being concerned about power, always being concerned about how you're going to actually build power in order to be able to push your issues, in order to be able to get the target to actually move in the way you want it to move." So that's the sort of link I see between education and social change. How can we educate in a way that organizes ourselves and our communities and mobilizes that organization to push the issues we need to see pushed in the ways we need to see them pushed towards making the changes that we need to see. I hope that this makes some sense to you all, and I look forward to working with you all on this project more in the future. Take care.